Welcome everybody to the second episode of Conversations, a series of webinars about Israel, international relations and law, organized by Think, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. My name is Anna-Rosa Schlechter and I'm your host. Today's conversation is about the Abraham Accords in international law, and I'm very happy to have today here with us our guest, Dr. Daphne Richemond-Barak, an assistant professor at the IDC in Herzliya. Thank you so much for being here with us. The moderator is Andrew Tucker, director of Think. And the audience, you may raise questions during the conversation, but also in the Q&A session following the conversation by using the Q&A button that you find at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try our best to answer all questions. And without further ado, I hand over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Anna-Rosa, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you might be around the world. And I believe we have people in this conversation from many different countries. The conversation series that we're doing is intended just to create a platform where we can talk about where international law is taking us, how it can play a positive role in promoting peace and security in the Middle East and beyond, what lessons can be learned, and what can we do as international lawyers engaging with diplomats and people from other disciplines to promote cooperation and friendly relations amongst nations. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Daphne Richemond-Barak with us. Welcome, Daphne. Great to have you from Israel.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure for me. And
we're going to talk today about the Abraham Accords, which I know is very much on your heart and on your mind. You're very involved in this new initiative, which is promoting cooperation between Israel and many other nations. Can you just explain to us a little bit what the Abraham Accords are?
Yes, of course. So the Abraham Accord, first of all, again, thank you for having me. I'm glad we're having this conversation. And, you know, message experts always say that every presentation is a conversation. So here we go. Here we're calling it a conversation. So we have this informal and really nice dynamic going in this forum. So thank you very much. The Abraham Accords are a series of agreements that were entered into between Israel and some Arab countries, signaling a change in the nature of their relationship, a shift in the geopolitical reality in the Middle East. And I think also it's in some ways in the rest of the world, because of course, a lot of eyes are always looking at the Middle East, and some of what happens in the Middle East can be felt, of course, as we have seen in the last couple of weeks, also elsewhere in the world. So these agreements are a way to warm the relationship between these countries, all of which Israel was not at war with. So it's not a peace accord per se. It's more about, some people call it normalization. You know, in French, we would call it rapprochement. It's something that is really, you can't really put it in a box, right? It's not going from war to peace, but it's going from something that, you know, being estranged from a country and then suddenly, and it was not suddenly, of course, but being in a much warmer relationship where a lot of things that were not possible before suddenly become possible, and great opportunities as well.
So these agreements were concluded in, I think, let's say the last months of the previous US administration. And I think President Trump and his team were very much a part of this process, weren't they? I recall the Abraham Declaration, I think, was mid-September 2020. And then there were these agreements. They're all slightly different from each other. One with the UAE and Israel, United Arab Emirates. There's another with Bahrain. There's an agreement with Morocco. There's an agreement with Sudan, which was concluded just before the end of December last year. So these are the sort of last weeks of the Trump administration. And we have a new administration now in the United States. How much are these a legacy of the Trump administration, and will they survive into the, the new realities of the Biden administration?
So you're right. It was really the last leg of the Trump administration, and what I view definitely as a great contribution to prosperity in the region, and I hope we will only see these relationships flourish, and maybe other states in addition to the UAE, which kind of paved the way. But in addition to Sudan, Morocco, and Sudan as well, will join the bandwagon and also seek a new paradigm, try out a new thing. If whatever we've done until now hasn't worked, then perhaps something else will. And this, of course, trickles down to the Palestinian conflict, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. But just to answer your question about President Biden, so far, it cannot be said that a lot has been done about the Abrahamic Accord, at least that we can witness publicly in terms of continuing this process or nurturing the process. But at the same time, there was this confrontation between Israel and Hamas, Operation Guardian of the Walls, which was going on for about 2 weeks, and it was just, it's a very fresh operation. And we saw that the Biden administration is inclined to show understanding for the reality of living, for Israel to border a terrorist state. And so I think that even though these are two different topics and they have to be kept separate, there's something to be said about the Biden administration showing this support for Israel. And hopefully this will also translate at some point into a restarting, right? A reset of this Abraham Accords process, and further nurturing and then further promoting it. But does that mean that, so I don't think the Biden administration is going to put this in jeopardy in any way. That would be really, I think, first of all, it would be bad policy in my view, but that would actually be a very counterproductive signal for the region. But so that's out of the picture. I'm also asked sometimes whether this would be for Israel. Is it possible if there's a new government in Israel that they would put the Abraham Accords in question? And no, I mean, I think they are here to stay. But the question is, how much are they going to be on the forefront of policy, and to what extent they're going to frame future relationships and actions. So here I want to say, yes, there's a great role to play for the United States and for the Biden administration. But to say that, only the whole thing is not in the hands of the Biden administration and whatever they decide to make of it is what will happen. No, because there are many other actors involved, not only Israel, of course, but also the countries of the Abraham Accords themselves. There's, of course, Saudi Arabia potentially in the future and others. And then also other external actors like the European Union, like the UN. So the United States is not alone in bearing the responsibility, I think, of the future of the Abraham Accords.
Thanks, Daphne. So if we just put a little bit in historical context, I think it might help. It certainly helps me to sort of understand where to place these. If you could, I think, go back 100 years to the beginning of, let's say, the tensions and conflicts in the region, at least from a modern perspective, really arose, didn't they, after the end of the First World War, when the collapse of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. All of this region was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which was run from Istanbul. And you didn't have the countries that you have today. The modern states were only created during the course of the 20th century. They resulted, some of them, from a mandate system that was implemented after the First World War. The mandates for Palestine, for Mesopotamia, and for Syria and Lebanon. Jordan was created out of the mandate for Palestine. I want to come back to Jordan in a moment as well. And so on the one hand, you had really two things going. One was sort of an Arab nationalism, which arose and grew during the first half of the 20th century. And that has been implemented in the large number of Arab states that we now have, or non-Arab states in the region. And you had Zionism and the creation of the Jewish state. And from the beginning, probably a conflict between Zionism and a certain element of Arab Palestinian leadership, which opposed Zionism. And for many years, it was after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, it became an Arab-Israeli conflict. At least that's what people saw it as, conflict between Israel and the Arab world. Mm-hmm. Then you had Jordanian occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Egypt occupying Gaza for 19 years until the Six-Day War. Then you had a process leading up to the Oslo agreements and the Jordanian peace treaty, and in the meantime, the Egyptian peace treaty. And then it became an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you had this whole idea that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be resolved before there can be peace in the Middle East. Now, that's the kind of Arab peace paradigm, isn't it, that we've lived with, I think, for the last decades. And this seems to be creating a new paradigm, because these Abraham Accords say, they refer, I think, to the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian conflict. But it's creating a new way, and I think this was reflective of Trump's approach, is to say, well, the way to peace and security in the Middle East is not through land for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It's about creating a culture of partnership, a culture of mutual respect and prosperity for the region. And that leads me to the question, is this really, are we talking about a new paradigm, or is this just like window dressing for, there have been, of course, strong relations between Israel and Morocco and the UAE for years. Is it just window dressing for something that's already been happening, or are we seeing potentially a new paradigm for peace in the region?
I would hope so. I would really, really hope so, because whatever has been going on until now with, so many Arab countries making decisions together, making policy together, acting as a bloc at the United Nations, without really, oftentimes under even the leadership of the Arab League, imposing certain course of action. This has not been very beneficial, not for the Palestinians themselves, who unfortunately suffer from an awful lack of leadership, but also not for the region as a whole. So I think that, yes, the answer to your question is yes, I would hope it's a new paradigm for a couple of reasons. First of all, it shows that Israel doesn't have to be the enemy. And if Israel ceases to be the enemy, the world does not collapse. That's the first message, which I think is really important. Yes, there have been these states where the culture, the education has inculcated values where Israel is constantly portrayed as the cause for all the trouble, as the reason for why there isn't peace in the Middle East, like you were saying, like until this conflict is resolved, Sunni and Shiite can continue to fight. It's okay. But as long as, the conflict is not resolved between Israel and the Palestinians, then that's the real issue, which obviously is not. And we've seen this with the Iran-Iraq war and many other conflicts going on in the region that have nothing to do with Israel. So I think the point is clear. There is an opportunity for a new paradigm. There's an opportunity for a new type of relationship of cooperation. How did Europe rebuild after World War II? There was this understanding that if you created economic ties and if you created a certain level of dependence and reliance, even if it's not dependence, reliance on the other, right, between France and Germany, and it would be this kind of like understanding that we need each other, and that if we don't have each other, then this will hurt us. This is how you create peace. So yeah, it would be wonderful if Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and others can enter into ties that go from anything from academic ties, which is something that I'm trying to promote, to business ties, which was I was referring to a second ago, where those business ties and those economic relations eventually will become strong enough to be able to maintain a reality where the states know that they need each other and therefore can work with each other. And I think this will be a promise for prosperity there, just like it was in Europe. So it can come in it can be a cooperation about water, for example. We all know about water diplomacy and what it can achieve. So water is an area where really the Middle East needs help. And southern Iraq will soon become too hot for people to even live there. So how do we deal with rising temperatures? How do we deal with climate change and water scarcity in the region? If one way to do that is to create this diplomacy and this cooperation around those issues. It can be the healthcare system, by the way, and emergency care for pandemic or for war or for other types of attacks. So yes, it's a new paradigm. It's an opportunity to not throw down. We're not throwing, and no one is throwing the baby with the bathwater right at the same time. It's not a challenge to the resolution of the Palestinian peace process. It's another way. It's something in addition. It's not instead. It's to show that some other way is possible. And I think in that way, I hope that it will lead to more cooperation, more ties in all sorts of, it's almost like putting together the fabric that is too hard to undo then if you don't want to be if something goes wrong. And I think this is what's happening now, and I hope it continues.
Thank you, Daphne. So you say it's not replacing the Arab peace, the Palestinian peace process, but that was clearly part of the mix, if you like. Thinking of last year, we had the whole discussion a few months earlier. You recall, in the context of Israeli elections and the prospect of so-called annexation of parts of the West Bank, and the Trump peace plan, which was launched, that we'd all been waiting for, and it was immediately rejected, by the way, by the Arab world and by the Palestinians. And then we had the normalization agreements, the Abraham Accords. And so there seems to be a nexus between the putting of annexation on the shelf. Annexation is not quite the right word, because Israel was, from Israel's perspective, seeking to apply sovereignty to parts of the West Bank, which it regards as being legitimately part of the state of Israel, potentially. How do we see that? I mean, what's the quid pro quo here? Was this a deal that was made in order to put that issue aside?
So you're going back on the context in which the Abraham Accords were entered into, at least, the first ones with the United Arab Emirates, and the effect of surprise, I think, that accompanied that announcement. I'm thinking virtually all quarters, it came as something that was perceived as quite a surprise. And what led to this surprise, or perhaps was the reason behind the surprise, is that there had been this announcement, which of course at the time we didn't put two and two together. We didn't know they were related, but the Israeli government had indeed announced that it would be annexing or establishing the sovereignty over parts of the West Bank. But the whole plan was really wrapped in a lot of secrecy or uncertainty. I remember having conversations at the time with members of the Knesset who also didn't know exactly what was going to be annexed, how much was going to be annexed, was it really going to be annexed, when was it going to happen? So none of this was really, really clear. And even though there was so much uncertainty, like you said, it triggered a wave of criticism about something that was really very, very, very vague at the time. And so the date that had been announced was July 1st, 2021. And the date passed and nothing was going on. And it wasn't really clear why the Israeli government was not coming forward and actually announcing this annexation plan or giving some more details about it. But like you said, I think both of them there's obviously a nexus between them, because then it was announced that in return for Israel shelving the annexation plan, the so-called annexation plan, which we of course never knew what it entailed, the UAE had agreed to normalize the relationship and entered into the Abraham Accords. So clearly there was something going on behind the scenes, and I think it's still unclear exactly what happened. But I want to add maybe another dimension to this, and add another type of actor, which is also, I know, something that Think really spends a lot of time thinking about, and that's the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Because what happened is that a few months before this whole annexation plan was announced, which was, I think it was January, the prosecutor of the ICC had referred to this intention of Israel to annex part of the West Bank. And it was believed that the ICC prosecutor was waiting for the announcement of Israel before issuing its decision on what constitutes territory for the purpose of the investigation of crimes on the territory of Palestine. And what's interesting is that in the middle of this complicated story, where you have the ICC, you have the annexation, and you have the UAE, the ICC decision did not happen, the annexation did not happen, and then suddenly there was this UAE announcement and Abraham Accord. So clearly, the speculation was that the ICC was waiting. The speculation was that the annexation was going to happen anytime soon. But ultimately, I think what came as the surprise was that the Abraham Accords were announced, and of course, the rest is history. So yeah, there's a strong nexus between what is going on among international actors in legal fora and in political fora with annexation, and apparently this new process of Abraham Accords undergoing in the region.
So, Daphne, are we seeing a realignment in the Arab world? We've just come out of a conflict, or you've just come out of a conflict with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, on the one hand, you could say this is just another conflict with Hamas. It's been going on for years. There's nothing new. On the other hand, I think one thing that has become clear out of the recent couple of weeks is the position of Iran, and the fact that Hamas is linked and funded and resourced by Iran. There's clearly an axis there between Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood potentially, extremist jihadic Islamic regimes on the one hand, and this other very different approach represented by the UAE and Bahrain and others. These are completely different ways of looking at the world, and yet they're both within what we used to call the Arab world. Are we seeing a fundamental shift in relationships in the Arab world? And should we be calling it the Arab world?
Yeah, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about whether it's one block, right? It's like whether this what used to be completely unified and going into one direction altogether can become maybe splintered a little bit now as a result of these few states having changed their relationship vis-a-vis Israel. So there's no doubt. The last operation, Guardian of the Walls, of the last couple of weeks between Israel and Hamas was a test for the Abraham Accords. I would like to think that the test was passed successfully. There are even some who say that part of the reason why this conflict happened is also to show that the Abraham Accords would not dramatically change the reality that Israel is facing, right? So Israel was happy, patted itself on the back. Okay, well, things are going to change now. And look, again, this confrontation with Hamas, which looks like just all of the previous confrontations before it, whether it is 2014, which was Operation Protective Edge, but also 2012, 2008. So there's been a few in the last decade or so. So to say that they came about because of the Abraham Accords, or to demonstrate that the Abraham Accords did not succeed in changing the paradigm, is one way to look at it. But I'd like to think that the Abraham Accords passed the test. I want to tell you what I think about the position of the countries from the Abraham Accords vis-a-vis this conflict. They were put in a very delicate situation. We can't expect things to change from A to Z from day one, in just half a year or even a year. It just doesn't work like this. So it's not an easy situation for states like UAE and Bahrain to find themselves in. They have to be very, very careful, of course, about their support to the Palestinian cause on one hand, and the reality that Israel and Israelis are facing on a daily basis. and this involvement of Iran, which, by the way, has always been clear to Israel. The fact that other states are having trouble, understanding it and acting upon it is a whole different story. So it's a test because of this, the need to say to make to give a certain discourse and save face, but at the same time wanting to preserve what is very, very dear, I think, to all parties, which is this normalization of the relationship. I want to tell you that I'm in touch with a lot of Emiratis as part of my work in the Women's Gulf Forum, which brings together Emirati women and Israeli women, but also as part of a policy group, the Gulf Israel Policy Forum, where we are basically international relations and international lawyers from all sorts of states in the region. Yes, there were tensions. Yes, there were moments where people preferred not to speak to each other because the sensitivity was too high. But did we ultimately stick together? Yes. Did we ultimately get exposed to views that we hadn't been exposed to before on both sides? Absolutely. Was it beneficial to all? And in a way, did it even strengthen the foundations of the Abraham Accord in a way that I think will carry forward for years to come? Because if we were able to overcome this, then hopefully, it will stick. So I think the bottom line is, in spite of all the criticism and even the cynicism and the attempts at trying to show that these accords won't work, and until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved, nothing can help. I hope they were proven wrong, and I'm assuming I saw what the UAE, for example, delegation said in a debate at the United Nations General Assembly about the operation. It was quite muted. It was not the kind of criticism that you would expect. I'm not saying that other Arab countries did not voice harsh criticism at Israel, but this is not the case for all of them, and certainly not for those who are members of the Abraham Accord.
So Daphne, you're very involved. You mentioned the Women's Forum, and I know you've been very involved in different levels in building economic and trade and investment relationships, and even academic cooperation. What's the atmosphere like in the UAE? Can you tell us just a little bit about your experience and how you think the Abraham Accord sort of helped promote? Because on the one hand, you could say these are just a piece of paper, it's a very high level diplomatic statements. It's not really affecting facts on the ground. But have these agreements really been able to help in changing the culture or stimulating the culture or encouraging people on the ground, face to face, business to business? What's your experience been over the last year?
So I started getting involved with mostly the UAE, but a little bit also with Bahrain, less so. Even before the Abraham Accords, I have to say that I was privileged to visit a few months before the Abraham Accords with the UAE were signed, and I right away thought to myself that it would be so much to be gained. And obviously, I was not the only one. There were many people who were doing business with the UAE between Israel and the UAE for years. But I think from an strictly academic standpoint, my visit there at that time really quite strikingly revealed the potential, the incredible potential that this relationship holds. So I started being active in trying to promote academic cooperation between IDC Herzliya, the institution that I'm affiliated with and where I teach, vis-a-vis other universities in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, etc. So in parallel, then of course, a few months later, the Abraham Accords were signed, and this changed the paradigm a bit. In some ways, it made everything more possible, but then quickly there was this sense that, okay, let's not rush, let's take it one step at a time. Especially Israelis, if you have some experience, they like to do things quite quickly, and I think they understood that we're in this for the long run, and it has to be done step by step. So I think here the potential for the women, which is something you highlighted, the role of women in peace and security is something that the United Nations has tried to promote for the past 20 years. It has imposed obligations on states to promote women in peace and security and encourage cooperation. This is the area, I mean, one of the areas where I think it would be fantastic for Emirati women and Israeli women, and maybe, of course, later on Bahraini and so on, Moroccan, Sudanese, to work together to think about what these accords mean and what their contribution could be to their implementation, but also with the UAE specifically. I have to say, the status of women in the UAE is quite remarkable. It's on one hand, it's a very, very traditional society, and women have a very traditional role. On the other, they are also very self-confident, and they don't feel threatened by this traditionalism. And they also are incredibly empowered by the society that they live in. And there's a lot that could be learned here as states, implement United Nations Security Council resolution on women in peace and security, and think about ways to better cooperate. So one way would be really for Israel and the UAE, for example, to think more about this. But I think generally women, education, involving women in this process and thinking about what they can do that perhaps men can do as well is another avenue through which this relationship has been evolving and flourishing. It goes through food and baking challah together, and also to having conversations about the role of the media, about national unity. It's really everything, but it's one avenue through which should be more exploited, and where we have already, in a way, created a basis for doing that. So I hope this will serve further the interest of all states.
Thank you. That all sounds very positive, and there's so much potential. The critics of the Accords, and we can move now to think, for example, about Europe as well. One of the things we see recently is, the increasing condemnation of Israel as an apartheid state, the growing sense that the occupation has become a sort of apartheid. We had the Human Rights Watch report just a few weeks ago, which is arguing that Israel is a pariah state, calling for boycotts. Here in the Netherlands, we've just had, just a week ago, 600 academics at the Netherlands, leading academic institutions, writing a document calling for the boycott of Israel, that it's an apartheid state. So the critics will say, well, this is all very nice, there's business and so forth with the UAE and others, but it's all at the cost of the Palestinians. It's at the cost of the weaker elements of society. The European Union, I think, has not really embraced the Abraham Accords. The EU's policy is still very much fixed around resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict before there can be peace in the region. I'm just wondering how we should see that. You have like a clash of paradigms in a way, clash of the way you look at the world. And you said at the beginning, it's not one or the other. I just wonder if you could sort of expand on that a little bit. And how do you see that as an international lawyer?
It's a game changer, I think, for the region, and also you mentioned Europe. It's also for Europe a game changer. Europe has tried for years to find ways in which to wondering about its own security, right? But trying to minimize the migration and war in the Middle East and instability more generally. So it should theoretically, I think, have greatly welcomed very, very warmly the signing of the Abraham Accords, and instead it took a very withdrawn position, which doesn't sit well with the other policies and concerns, security concerns that the EU has trying to alleviate over the years. Very, very strange, and in my view also unacceptable. That's besides the point. what's behind it probably is the feeling that this is inconsistent, once again, with having a Palestinian state, inconsistent with resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which it isn't. It's not at all inconsistent. One can want a Palestinian state, which is my case, and still be in favor of the Abraham Accords. Why would the two be incompatible? And I think that anyone who takes peace and prosperity in the Middle East seriously owes it to himself or herself to seriously consider the inconsistency that lies in a position that says, "Oh no, the Abraham Accords, forget it. It's not. They won't change anything. Let's not even invest in them, or let's not even talk about them as something of substance." Which I've heard, by the way, recently, people saying, including in the United States, "Oh, there's nothing of substance there. You know, this is just like a piece of paper," which it is not, because it actually sets forth international legal obligations. But that's a different story. So. There's many ways in which this cooperation between these states can benefit also Palestinians, by the way. Whether this is in Jerusalem, I know Jerusalem as a city is very much engaged in trying to create technological hubs, have Israeli Arabs who are living there work in remotely, even for UAE companies, and so on and so forth. So there are many ways this can be done, but if you rule it out everything from the outset, then of course, then it won't happen. But to me, a person who does not support the Abraham Accords needs to do some serious introspection here as to how could that be. This is the best way to get to prosperity and stability in the region, while continuing, of course, to engage. And we saw the Palestinian conflict is not going away. Hamas is not going away. But why wouldn't that change still the relationship with other states? And of course, even the Abraham Accords countries, they continue to talk about occupation, and they continue to talk about the Palestinian state, and that's totally to be expected. They are just a little bit, I think it came on their part from a fatigue of providing high amounts of financial assistance to a leadership. It's not the Palestinian people here that anyone is concerned about in terms of partners, right? We know that the Palestinian people is suffering and deserves its state, but the problem is their leadership, who got control of the West Bank in 2005 after Israel unilaterally withdrawn, said, okay, you can have it, just we won't be there anymore. And this was supposed to bring peace, but it didn't.
So the Gaza Strip. Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the suggestions has been that actually the Gulf states and the other Abraham Accord states could be, partnering with Israel and with positive elements in Palestinian society to, if you think about the reconstructing Gaza or promoting economic development in the West Bank, practical projects building on the Abraham Accords, trying to promote partnerships and cooperation in the area of tourism, in the area of education, research and development. Is there potential there for the UAE, for example, to play a role in? Absolutely,
and this is really part of the conversation as we speak. I mean, I was telling you about this women's Emirati and Israeli women talking to each other. This is the kind of forum where these ideas are bounced, and UAE women say, "Okay, contact me. I can help you. Let's bring it to Jerusalem. Let's try to get our cooperation to benefit Palestinians as well." This is totally and completely part of it. It maybe it's not seen yet as openly as one might like, but I would expect that in the next 2-3 years, these initiatives that are just burgeoning right now will come and become much more concrete. And this can be, by the way, initiatives that are launched at the private, entrepreneurial level, but it could also definitely be, like I was mentioning before, the city of Jerusalem, proactively seeking the cooperation of the Abraham Accord states for the benefit of its Palestinian population.
So I'm sorry to sort of keep going on about the Palestinian situation, but because I know we want to sort of broaden it, but I think it's important because it seems to me you're having a sort of, there's a conflict within Palestinian society between, let's say, the radical elements, which is potentially very religiously driven, and let's say the more moderate ones who are interested in, people who are interested in just building a positive society. And, you know, Hamas is now sort of claiming the middle ground, as it were, even in the West Bank. Are you seeing evidence on the ground of this conflict? And are you hopeful about where Palestinian society is heading? Do you think, or is that analysis not correct?
The leadership being in the hands of Hamas is terrible for the fate of the Palestinian people. And when I saw the demonstrations in Europe and in the United States, all over the world, really, except in the Abrahamic countries, which is also quite interesting, in support for free Palestine and against the operation that Israel was engaged in, it's very easy to forget that the support is essentially brought to Hamas it shouldn't be that by supporting Palestine, you're supporting Hamas. But the truth of the matter is that in the context of this particular operation, it definitely was, right? If you say, I support, I'm against Israel here, then you're supporting the actions of Hamas, which include, sending missiles directed at civilian population, digging cross-border tunnels, and sending booby trap balloons and kites at the border all the time, in the southern border. But people tend to forget that under the ideological and very valuable goal of having a Palestinian state. But right now, this is not the way forward. The way forward is for the Palestinian people to get better leadership. By the way, Israel is also having issues of leadership, of course, totally different, cannot be compared. But there is a crisis going on in the region, I think, on both sides in terms of leadership, and hopefully. Also, I think one of the things that Israel has to do, and this is one of the greatest lessons, the most depressing lessons for all Israelis, by the way, the most depressing part of Guardian of the Walls was that there was so much discontent among Israeli Arabs that they were able to burn cars, attack Jews, just in the street for just being there, because they don't, because they associate with Hamas, because they don't feel a part of Israeli society. I saw some Israeli Arabs who were encouraging supporting Hamas, and the reporter asked them, but do you realize that by supporting Hamas, you're actually encouraging them to send more rockets, and those rockets are sent to you personally because you live in Israel and you're an Israeli citizen? And they said, no, but that's totally fine. They should continue. It doesn't matter if it reaches us. Continue to send missiles. So it's really, really deep. And this is something in the fabric of Israeli society that is broken for whatever reason, and must, in an emergency, this is really the future of the state and its cohesion at stake. It must be mended. I know, for example, that IDC is having a meeting with its president and its students in order to think about ways in which this specific problem, can be solved. This is a time to be creative and take things into our hands. It's good to talk about Israeli society as like made up of different clusters of people: the Orthodox, the Jews, the Christians, the Arabs, you name it, the anti-religious. But ultimately, they all have to live together, all these groups. So separating them and putting them in boxes is not going to help. On the contrary, we need to come with a program of national unity, because the most problematic message of this latest confrontation, which vis-a-vis Hamas looked like all others, but vis-a-vis inside Israel looked so different. And that's where most of the work, I believe, and I hope, of the Israeli state will be directed, hopefully.
Thank you. Well, one last question for you, Daphne, before we go into the Q&A, and there's some very interesting questions coming in. The hot potato, I suppose, or the elephant in the room, you might say, is religion. Now, the Abraham Accords, they're not called for nothing, the Abraham Accords. They recognize that Abraham is the father of the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it speaks, I think, in a very interesting way about, the common identity, respecting differences between us, but our common identity. And it's about religious identity, but also about national identity. And I'm wondering at the end of the day, because this recent conflict was also very much about the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Hamas, putting itself out there as the liberator of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount. And this is still very much, Arab League and OIC, Islamic Organization of Islamic Cooperation policies, the liberation of Jerusalem. Is it possible, and this is probably an impossible question for you to answer, but, I guess the Gulf states have the luxury that they don't have a territorial boundary with Israel, so they can avoid that question in a way. But at the end of the day, that's going to be a question for the Islamic world, is to whether they're really willing to promote cooperation, even at a religious level, or are they going to fight for exclusive domination? I've seen Mahmoud Abbas, for example, saying that, if there's to be a resolution also of the Gaza conflict, Jews will not be allowed on the Temple Mount. Now, to my mind, that goes completely against the spirit of what's being said in the Abraham Accords. And one would hope that this development will promote a different kind of dialogue.
I cannot agree more with you. If we ever thought that Jerusalem had, somehow lost in its symbolism and significance and had been accepted as clearly it's at the center of everything. We saw how this entire escalation, and it was not something that started with Jerusalem and in some kind of unexpected way deteriorated into this Operation Guardian of the Walls. Not at all. This is not what happened. It was built from scratch in a very, very careful and calculated fashion to begin with Jerusalem, to establish the legitimacy, to rally the spirit and the forces around it, because of course the eviction of Palestinians from their homes and Al-Aqsa Mosque, all of this, and during Ramadan and Jerusalem Day, the timing was not innocent either. The entire escalation, so-called escalation, was carefully planned, but it had as its base Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is where it all begins and ends. At the same time, one aspect of these Abraham Accords, as you eloquently explained, is to bring together the religions. And I would hope that even in our audience today, we have people from all three faiths, right? It's the Abrahamic house is being built in the UAE in order to serve as a temple for this coexistence and respect and tolerance for religion. In the UAE, I have to say, there is definitely a lot of tolerance and understanding for others and how they do their business. I think it comes from a lot of self-confidence, again, coming from this rather traditional society in who it is, so that it can then open up to others. This is something that I've found absolutely fascinating about their people. So Israel needs to continue to have access, obviously, to its religious sites. We know that when Israel lost, when Jerusalem was no longer in the control of Jerusalem, Jews could no longer pray in their religious sites. This has not happened at any point when the control is in the hands of Israelis. So and Jordanians, of course. So the status quo, because this is how we call it, right? We call it the status quo here. It shouldn't budge. This is the status quo. It should remain. But should we find ways in which we can better understand ourselves? Should the Abrahamic house in the UAE serve as a neutral forum and place where more dialogue can take place and the significance of these sites can be exchanged, and hopefully better I hope it would be, not everything will be interpreted also badly. You know, in Jerusalem, they put, I don't know if you're aware of the tragedy that happened in Israel when too many people got together in a religious site for a celebration in Meron. And just a few weeks later, there was the Ramadan and the Eid in Jerusalem. And so the Jerusalem municipality put up some barriers in order so that not too many people will go in. It was also because of COVID and a lot of people being together, but also because of this fear that, again, we have to control how many people get into a place at the same time. This was filmed. This was interpreted as preventing religious pilgrims from entering their holy sites. So we want to get to a situation where not everything is so heated and not every action is interpreted wrongly. That should be the aim.
At the end of the day, I mean, that's a really important point that you're making is, I think since 1967, Israel has protected the holy sites and it has ensured access and freedom of religion and worship for all the faiths. You can be a Muslim, a Christian, a Hindu in Israel, and you have freedom of worship.
And Baha'i.
And Baha'i, whatever. That was not the case during Jordanian occupation of the West Bank. And I think it's important to stress that, this is very much part of Israeli identity, and Judaism is to protect the validity and respect the freedom of others. My concern would be that this sort of opening up to Abrahamic cooperation is a kind of a backdoor way of, sort of internationalizing Jerusalem, for example, and saying, well, it shouldn't be under Israeli control because everybody's equal. And I think that would be dangerous because Israel has proven that it can protect the holy basin better than anybody's ever been able to do.
I think it's not open for discussion. I mean, I don't think that's the objective. I think the objective is greater tolerance, more understanding, dialogue. I don't view this as threatening the status quo in Jerusalem, and I think I don't think we have to worry about this. It won't happen. So
okay,
I don't believe it. But perhaps we have a Q&A now. I don't know.
Okay.
To do.
So let's look at some of the questions, Daphne. Thank you very much for all your explanations and insights into this. Esther in Singapore says, first of all, thank you, Daphne. Have you thought what the Abraham Accord should mean to countries outside of Israel and the Middle East, to Asian nations? In other words, is the Abraham Accord normative in international law?
So I'll tell you something. First of all, Esther, thank you. I have a funny anecdote to share with you. As their midterm assignment, I gave my students in international law a whole assignment on the Abraham Accords and their legal normative value and all sorts of questions related to them. And one of them was whether they could create customary international law. So it's very similar to what you're asking me now. Could it resonate legally, not politically? Because politically, clearly it can resonate. And I would hope that it would also kind of touch the Asian world. That would be fantastic. But legally, and I think this is the core of your question, can they create some kind of norm for others that nations would have to abide to? I have to say, I don't believe it, because it's a bilateral relationship. I think bilateral relationship, even in the international legal framework, they are more akin to a contract, meaning this is something you and I agree. It doesn't affect, another state in a different continent. So yes, it could bring down some dominoes in the political arena and get others to rethink their relationship with Israel and the dynamic that they have with our countries, because it's not just about Israel, it's much more broad than that. But to say that it would start binding upon them, then I don't think so. But you can take issue with that, or definitely.
Thank you. I think it's a really important question. And Singapore, of course, is very interesting because it's also a small country nestled in between large Islamic neighbors, and it's trying to hold this balance between the different faiths. So there are potentially big lessons to be learned. Matthew from the Czech Republic says, who is the partner for negotiations between Israel and Arab countries? Is it religious leaders or individual mighty sheikhs or governments? And how is the Arab League involved in the process of the Abraham Accords?
I would respond quite categorically here. We're talking about governments. I mean, the Arab League is an interesting forum. Maybe this is a place where these issues will be debated. But I think I made it clear early on that to some extent those times are over. There's still going to be the Arab League, but does that mean that there should be a uniform stance at all times on every single issue? No. So governments will talk, not the sheikhs and not the rabbis, but the political leaders. They might be religious political leaders, but they are political leaders nevertheless, and they are the ones who will decide. That's pretty clear to me.
Okay. Chaim asks the question, Chaim from Israel, about, we talked a little bit about apartheid. How do the Abraham Accord members stand vis-a-vis the Arab boycott? Yeah.
I wonder if there's really a connection there between all these attempts at boycotting Israel, whether they come from the Arab world or they come from other places in the world. And you were mentioning an attempt that I didn't know about, Andrew, which is concerning. These boycotts, Israelis in general, they are cynics. They have never taken really these boycotts very, very seriously, in the sense that these boycotts, and there's a reason for that, they have never really impacted Israel in any meaningful way. So while they are unpleasant and they are concerning and they should be avoided and fought, to say that this is the top priority line for Israel, no. Because this is not the aspect that has most direct impact on Israeli economy or security or even tourism, or you name it. In the end of the day, the impact of these boycotts is quite limited. And so it hasn't been among the priorities of Israel to fight them or to come up with like a policy that would be well known to everyone. I think they are dealt with, kind of like sporadically, and try to be avoided whenever, we can see that the tensions are rising. But I wouldn't look at that as a major threat, not to the Abraham Accords and not to Israel in general.
Okay, thank you. Alessandro from Italy, I presume. Alessandro, you say that Alessandro is telling us that the link to the Abraham Accords has been dropped from the White House website. The same goes with Pompeo's statement on the legality of settlements. Both are at the core of Trump's policies in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So actually, I'm not quite sure. It may have been dropped from the White House. I know it's still on the State Department website. I haven't checked the Pompeo statement, by the way. I don't know if that's been dropped from the State Department website. Do you know, Daphne?
I've always accessed it, I think, from the State Department. So I don't know, like you, I think this was always where it was. I'm not sure if it was on the website. Probably, maybe yes. I mean, I'm assuming Alessandro is right. But again, let me go back, even if it's true, okay? And I'm not saying it's not a signal or it's not something to be concerned about, but let's not put the responsibility of these accords. The United States has already done a huge amount of work. Whether it was the Biden administration or the Trump administration is irrelevant. The United States has given a lot of energy to this accord, to this movement. Now it is time for other actors to show some leadership, just like the US has done, and give meaning to these new relationships. And that includes the EU, okay, which I mentioned before. That includes the UN, which should be embracing an event of historic proportions, which fits right into the first article of its charter. Okay, Article 1 of the United Nations Charter is all about maintaining international peace and security. So what is it? How can you not, and this is kind of going back to what I was saying before, how can you look at yourself in a mirror, say you're a peace-loving person, aspiring person or institution, and not support these accords? So again, let's not put the US definitely has a role to play, but it doesn't take away from what other states and by the way, it involves individual states as well. It's not necessarily the UN, the EU. It could be individual states who are suddenly sitting down and saying to the Israel and to Bahrain, for example, okay, I want to work with you guys. What can we do? We care about prosperity in the Middle East. We care about stability, even if it's for our own selfish interest. Okay, that's realism. That's fine. But we are going to sit at the table with you, and we're going to find ways to translate those agreements in action items for everyone to benefit from, including, of course, the Palestinians.
Look, I agree with you. I mean, I think certainly as an international lawyer, if you look at the UN, it's become a kind of a platform where, the concept of human rights has become a tool in a way to avoid putting the spotlight on countries which do oppress human rights and to condemn Israel. Whereas this is saying, well, the true way of improving the lives of people is not by criticizing Israel the whole time, but by actually doing something to improve the lives of people on the ground. And one would hope that this kind of change of attitude is going to also have an effect. Unfortunately, the UN operates, because of its voting system of blocks of power, it's going to be very hard to change that kind of discussion, isn't it, within the UN system?
Yes, but if it's a one piece and people, diplomat to diplomat, person to person, businessman to businessman, academic to academic, security expert to security expert, if women to women, children to children, because there's also children's program. And at IDC, we just welcoming our first in-person Emirati students this week. We have already one who's studying online, but one in person. This is what's going to matter. And at the United Nations, it will be felt. It will maybe take longer because everything takes longer at the UN, but eventually it will happen there as well. If this diplomat and this diplomat understand the meaning, then the bloc will splinter. Then there would be more freedom to, we already even saw it now with the statements that were given in supposedly criticism about Israel. There was harsh criticism, but there was also general statements that were made about supporting a Palestinian state or asking both sides to de-escalate. This is not the harsh voices that we've heard before. So things will change little by little.
Okay. Two more questions and then we'll draw it to a close. Daphne, Sandra, slightly off topic, she asks, are there any ideas of extending the Women's Forum to a broader Middle Eastern Women's Forum, not just for the Abrahamic Accord partners? This is a good question for you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sandra. I don't know where you're from, but we really did think about this quite a bit. Do we make it only about UAE? Because initially it started with the UAE. Eventually we got more women joining from Bahrain. We would love to welcome Moroccans. We've had some Zoom events also with Moroccan women. Sudan, I believe, less so. Could we welcome others from the Middle East? Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're interested or if you know someone who would be interested, you can definitely write me. You can find my email on the IDC website, and I'll be more than happy to chat about this in private.
Excellent. Chaim has a number of questions. One is, he says, are you aware, Daphne, the Rand Corporation has published an extensive report on the economic implications of a free trade agreement among the Abraham Accord countries, which I think the prognosis is it would significantly improve employment and GDP.
Yeah, I mean, that's not surprising.
Yeah.
But I know about the report. This is exactly what will happen, and it's already happening. So it will increase employment, it will increase GDP. But I think what your point that you made, Andrew, is so important. It's also about people and human security, right? Livelihood, water, fighting the effects of climate change. All of this is going to generate incredible amount of cooperation. I know that the UAE, for example, is really interested in nanotechnology, which is an area where Israel is a very tech country, so there's definitely a lot that can be contributed there. Yes, so the short answer is absolutely, and I'm not surprised. I know about it, and this is what is to be expected.
Great. I think this will be the last question. It's about Iran, and I'll read it to you. As you said, Biden will not turn the clock back. In recent years, there was a power vacuum in the Middle East in terms of great power struggles to secure influence. To what extent did the US act mainly to counteract Chinese and Russian influence in the region? How do you see the Abraham Accords solidifying US influence in the Gulf states? And how problematic is Qatar? What about in its fight with the Saudis and the Gulf states? As I'm just reading this, as the Arab partners in the Abraham Accords have not dissimilar views of Iran as those held by Israel, will the US try to change these Arab views vis-a-vis Iran?
So Chaim, can you stay for another hour?
Chaim is in Israel, so I can connect you and you can have that conversation.
So we have very little time, and it's obviously a huge question about Qatar, which is playing a very sneaky role here, an important role, but also Saudi Arabia, which is probably more going to join, I think, the bandwagon. It's probably leading the bandwagon behind the scene, and eventually it will join it. I don't know if it's about the region, like a soft power kind of thing vis-a-vis China. Maybe as like a secondary effect, but it's not the main. I don't think that's the main. I think the main objective is really genuinely prosperity, stability in the region, better life for people, fewer wars. I mean, really the basic kind of things that we've been speaking about, and maybe it also, creates a sphere of influence for the United States. But I'm not sure that's what's driving it as the main driver. But it would be interesting to see how China reacts. By the way, I saw somebody was asking if the latest confrontation was about the failure of the Abraham Accords. So I tried to answer this, and no, it was not at all about the failure of the Abraham Accords, because there have been confrontations with Hamas virtually every 2 or 3 or 4 years for the past decade. And so to blame that on the Abraham Accords is just a fallacy in my view. I think maybe that's a wrap. I don't know.
Yeah, that's cool. Daphne, thanks so much. It's been fascinating talking with you. Do you have last thing you want to share with us about we can take away with us?
Yeah, sure. Again, we welcome here at IDC and in Israel more generally, we'll welcome all citizens of the Abraham Accords countries to come and study here, to learn about the Middle East in the Middle East, to build together a better Middle East. We have many, many students who are incredibly involved in this. So if you have friends or family in those countries or in the Middle East or in the broader world who want this more than anything, you should send us, they should get involved. There's a lot that can be done. And I think organizations like Think who are, trendsetters in this, because they understand the importance of these accords, and they want to make a point about the fact that they are an opportunity more than a challenge, and this is how they should be interpreted for the benefits of all, including all religions and all people. It sounds cliche, and I think this is why maybe some people are so easily dismissive of it. But ultimately, this is where the answer lies. And thank you for having me and enabling me to discuss this with you. It was a pleasure. And thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Daphne Richemond-Barak in Israel from the IDC Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, doing great work, I believe, to promote this idea of cooperation, partnership, mutual respect as being the pathway to peace in the Middle East. So we look forward at Thinkers to continuing this conversation about what is the road towards peace and prosperity in the Middle East and beyond, what role international law can play in promoting these values. And we encourage you to join us next time. Thank you for joining us today. We wish you all well, wherever you might be, and we look forward to seeing you in our next conversation in a few weeks' time. Back to you, Ana Rosa.
Yes, also thank you for my part, Daphne, and also Andrew. And of course, to our participants, I would just like to let you know that the recording of this session will be soon made available on the website, also as a podcast. And the next episode is also going to be an interesting one. It is scheduled for 24th of June, also at 11 a.m. Central European time. And our guest will be also from Israel coming in, Professor Robbie Sabel from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he will speak with us about the Oslo Accords and international law. So we look forward to meeting with all of you soon again, and I will say bye for now.